He ate the pork skewer in Chengdu. His best friend stood beside him and said no. Same trip, same city, same street. One of them came home with souvenirs. The other came home with something alive inside his brain. 62 days after that night market in China, Michael Turner collapsed face first into the frozen foods aisle of a grocery store in San Diego. Witnesses heard the shopping cart slam sideways before they heard him hit the floor. His body locked rigid. His arms jerked violently against the tiles. Blood pooled beneath his mouth. And when doctors scanned his brain 3 hours later, they found dozens of cysts embedded inside both hemispheres. Each one contained a living parasite. But here is the part doctors could not explain to his family. They could not kill the worms immediately. Because if too many died at once, Michael's brain would swell until it crushed itself against the inside of his skull. This is Hidden Pathogens? Michael Turner and Mason Reed had been planning the trip for almost 11 months. Both 29, both from California, both software engineers, and both completely burned out. The trip was supposed to reset them. 3 weeks across China: Beijing, Shanghai, Xi'an, Chengdu. Mason planned everything carefully. He researched food safety before the flight even left LX, downloaded travel advisories, watched CD videos, read forums written by expats living in China. He packed electrolyte packets, water purification tablets, hand sanitizer, antibiotics, and a printed emergency contact sheet. Michael made fun of him constantly. "You packed like we're invading a country, Mason." Mason always replied the same way. "You only get one stomach." That sentence stopped being funny later because Mason followed rules. Michael followed curiosity. That was the difference between them. And by the end of the trip, only one of them would return home the same person. On the 9th night of the trip, they arrived in Chengdu. The city glowed after dark. Steam rolled through narrow alleyways beneath red lanterns. Oil crackled across massive steel pans. Vendors shouted over crowds packed shoulder to shoulder through the market streets. Everything smelled alive. Garlic, charcoal, chili oil, boiling broth, fermented spices. Michael loved it instantly. He filmed everything: the flames, the skewers turning over open heat. At 11:18 p.m., the two friends stopped at a pork skewer stall near the south side of the market. The vendor worked fast. Too fast. Bare hands. Raw meat beside cooked meat. No refrigeration, no running water visible anywhere. Mason noticed immediately. Michael did not care. The pork smelled incredible. Fat dripping into open flames, smoke rising into the cold night air. The vendor handed Michael a skewer. Mason shook his head immediately. "No chance," Michael laughed. "You're paranoid." Mason pointed toward the center of the meat, still pink, still soft. "Dude, that's undercooked." Michael took a bite anyway. Juice ran down his hand. He smiled instantly. "It's worth it." Mason bought bottled water from a sealed refrigerator nearby. Michael ordered another skewer, then another, 3 total. The two friends walked back through the market afterward laughing. One of them already had parasites moving through his digestive tract. He just didn't know it yet. Here is what happened inside Michael's body that night. The pork carried microscopic parasitic larvae, invisible to the naked eye. The heat from the grill had partially cooked the outside, but the center of the meat never reached a temperature high enough to kill them. Michael swallowed the larvae alive. Inside his stomach, they survived digestion. Then came the dangerous part. The organisms attached themselves to the wall of his small intestine. Tiny hooks, tiny mouths, tiny living organisms adapting instantly to the inside of a human body. Then they penetrated the intestinal lining itself, crossing directly into the bloodstream. From there, Michael's blood carried them everywhere: his muscles, his liver, his lungs, and eventually his brain. Most people imagine brain infections happening immediately. That is not how this works. The terrifying part is the delay, because during the early stage, the victim feels almost completely normal. The parasites spread quietly, silently, without pain, without warning. Michael spent the rest of the trip believing he was perfectly healthy. 5 days later, the two friends boarded a return flight to California. Michael edited vacation videos on his laptop during the flight, laughed at market footage, sent photos to co-workers, told everyone the Chengdu skewers were the best food he had ever eaten. Mason still looked uneasy. "You sure your stomach feels okay?" Michael laughed again. "I told you, I'm fine." That sentence appears constantly in medical investigations. "I'm fine." Because most neurological infections do not begin dramatically. They begin invisibly. Weeks can pass before the brain realizes something is wrong. And during those weeks, the organisms continue moving deeper into the body. By the time symptoms appear, the damage may already be extensive. 14 days after returning home, Michael developed a headache, not severe, just pressure behind his eyes. He blamed jet lag, then dehydration, then stress. He worked 12-hour shifts editing video campaigns from his apartment. Headaches did not feel unusual. But over the next several days, the pain changed. It became sharper, more localized. Always behind the right eye, sometimes accompanied by brief moments of confusion. One afternoon, Michael forgot the password to his work laptop. A password he typed almost every day for 3 years. Another time, he stood inside a grocery store staring at shelves for nearly 20 seconds because he could not remember why he entered the aisle. Small failures, tiny neurological cracks. The kind most people dismiss immediately. But inside his skull, fluid-filled cysts were already forming around the parasites, and with each cyst, pressure inside the brain increased, slowly, silently. Around day 22, Mason noticed something wrong during a phone call. Michael repeated the same story twice within 10 minutes, not jokingly, not absent-mindedly. Exactly the same way, same pauses. Mason interrupted him carefully. "You already told me that." Silence. Then Michael laughed nervously. "Seriously?" At first, they blamed exhaustion. Too much screen time, too little sleep, too much caffeine, normal explanations, comforting explanations. But neurological infections survive because symptoms imitate ordinary problems during the beginning. That delay allows the parasites time to grow, time to spread, time to establish themselves deep inside tissue before doctors even suspect they exist. And by day 22, Michael's brain was already under attack. Then came the nightmares. Michael began waking suddenly around 3 a.m. every night, sweating heavily, heart racing, sometimes gasping for air. One night, his girlfriend woke up to hear him whispering repeatedly in his sleep, "There's something moving," over and over, "There's something moving." At the time, she thought he was delirious. But later, those words became horrifying because inside his brain, something actually was moving. Michael finally visited urgent care. He described headaches, insomnia, nausea, memory problems, and pressure behind his eye. The physician performed a basic neurological exam. "Follow the finger, push against my hand, smile." Everything appeared normal. Diagnosis: stress, migraines, sleep deprivation. Michael was prescribed migraine medication and told to reduce screen exposure. Nobody asked about China. Nobody asked about undercooked pork. Nobody considered parasites. Because in most American clinics, brain parasites are extraordinarily rare. And what doctors do not expect, they often fail to see. Michael walked out believing the medication would solve everything. Meanwhile, the cysts inside his brain continued expanding. By day 41, Michael stopped driving at night. Bright headlights triggered stabbing pain inside his skull. His vision blurred intermittently. Coworkers noticed personality changes. He became irritable, forgetful, detached. One coworker later described him as present physically, but mentally somewhere else. The parasites had triggered inflammation around neural tissue responsible for memory and sensory processing. His brain was beginning to malfunction under pressure. And nobody understood why. Not yet. Day 62, 7:14 p.m., a grocery store parking lot in San Diego. Michael unloaded shopping bags from his trunk. Then the world disappeared. Witnesses described him suddenly freezing in place before collapsing violently against the pavement. His arms locked rigid, his jaw clenched shut. Blood appeared beside his mouth. Then came the convulsions. A woman nearby screamed for help. Paramedics arrived within minutes. Michael regained consciousness briefly inside the ambulance, confused, unable to speak properly. Then he seized again, this time longer, more violently. And when doctors finally scanned his brain, they found something that terrified the entire emergency department. The first CT scan lasted less than 4 minutes. The silence afterward lasted much longer. Inside the emergency department at UC San Diego Medical Center, the radiologist enlarged the images repeatedly, then called another physician into the room, then another. Because Michael's brain did not look normal, multiple ring-shaped lesions appeared across both hemispheres, small white circles scattered through the tissue like impact craters. There were too many to count quickly. The ER physician initially suspected metastatic cancer, stage 4, unknown primary source. It was the only explanation most of them had ever seen that resembled imaging like this. Michael's girlfriend arrived 20 minutes later, so did Mason. The doctor spoke carefully. We found extensive lesions throughout his brain. Lesions, not tumors, not parasites, just lesions. Medical language becomes vague when doctors are uncertain. We believe this may be advanced metastatic cancer. Michael stared upward silently from the hospital bed. Mason later admitted the word cancer barely sounded real when he heard it. Michael was 29 years old, healthy, active, no smoking history, no family neurological disease. None of it made sense, and yet the scans were sitting directly in front of them. Dozens of abnormalities embedded inside his brain. At 11 a.m., Michael seized again, this time inside the hospital. Nurses rushed into the room after hearing equipment crash against the floor. His body convulsed violently beneath the blankets, heart rate spiking, oxygen dropping, blood pressure climbing rapidly. The swelling inside his skull was worsening. Doctors administered anticonvulsants immediately, then steroids, then additional imaging, and during the MRI, one physician noticed something strange. The lesions looked unusually symmetrical, too round, too evenly distributed. Cancer spreads chaotically. This looked different, almost deliberate, like something had placed them there one by one. That observation changed everything. The infectious disease specialist entered Michael's room the next morning. She reviewed the scans quietly, then asked a question nobody else had asked. "Has he traveled internationally recently?" Mason answered instantly. "China, about 2 months ago." The doctor looked up immediately. "Did he eat street food?" Mason hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Undercooked pork skewers." The atmosphere inside the room changed instantly. Because now, for the first time, someone suspected a parasite, real quick. If stories like this fascinate you, hit subscribe right now. Because honestly, most people watch one video, say "I'll subscribe later," and never come back. And if you don't subscribe, at least go to the comments and tell me what's stopping you. I actually read them. Blood tests were ordered immediately. Additional imaging followed. And over the next several hours, the physicians began considering a diagnosis almost nobody in the room had ever personally treated before: neurocysticercosis, a parasitic infection capable of embedding cysts directly inside the brain. The condition is caused when parasitic larvae migrate through the bloodstream and invade neural tissue. In many regions of the world, it remains one of the leading causes of preventable epilepsy. But in American hospitals, most doctors encounter it rarely. That rarity is part of what makes cases like Michael's so dangerous. Because the infection hides behind ordinary symptoms: headaches, nausea, confusion, fatigue. Symptoms millions of people experience every day. And by the time seizures begin, the parasites may already be deeply established. Michael's brain scans suggested dozens of cysts, possibly more. Each one represented a living organism surrounded by inflamed tissue. And now doctors faced a terrifying problem. Treating the parasites aggressively could kill him. Here is why. The parasites survived inside Michael's brain partly because they suppressed immune activity around themselves. Each cyst acted almost like camouflage. The brain tolerated their presence temporarily, but when anti-parasitic medication kills the larvae, that camouflage disappears. The immune system suddenly recognizes the dead organisms as foreign invaders, and it attacks violently. Inflammation explodes, pressure inside the skull rises. The brain begins swelling against bone that cannot expand. Too much swelling causes herniation. The brainstem compresses downward through the base of the skull. Breathing stops. Heart function fails. Death follows quickly. Patients with a small number of cysts are usually treatable. Michael did not have a small number. He had dozens, possibly more than 40. Which meant every dead parasite could trigger another wave of swelling. The medication capable of saving his life could also destroy his brain. Mason barely slept during those first hospital days. He replayed the Chengdu night market repeatedly in his mind. The smoke, the skewers, the moment Michael laughed and took the first bite. Same trip, same city, same street, one decision. That thought began haunting him constantly because, psychologically, survivors often experience a strange form of guilt after medical disaster, especially when they escaped by accident. Mason kept thinking, if I ordered one skewer too, would both of us be here? He never asked the question out loud, but it stayed with him anyway. During additional scans, doctors found another cyst behind Michael's right eye, small but active. The parasite had migrated through ocular tissue before embedding near the optic structures. That discovery explained the headaches, the blurred vision, the pressure behind the eye. And it introduced a new fear: blindness. Because if inflammation spread aggressively through the ocular nerves, the damage could become permanent. Michael learned this while lying beneath fluorescent hospital lights, listening to physicians discuss his brain like a battlefield. Parasites, swelling, seizures, vision loss, possible surgery. Nothing about the conversation sounded real, because the human mind struggles to process biological horror when it arrives slowly. People imagine catastrophic illness happening instantly: car crashes, heart attacks, gunshots. But infections like this feel psychologically different. You continue living normally while something silently grows inside you. That delay creates terror later. Because once symptoms appear, the realization hits all at once. The danger began weeks ago. Doctors decided to begin cautious treatment using steroids first. The goal was simple: reduce inflammation before killing the parasites. Michael started dexamethasone immediately, then anticonvulsants, then monitored observation inside the neurology wing. For 48 hours, doctors waited, because if swelling increased too quickly, they would stop everything. At first, the treatment appeared stable. Then Michael developed another seizure. Longer this time, more violent. Nurses restrained his arms as monitors screamed across the room. His oxygen levels crashed. And afterward, he could not remember his girlfriend's name for nearly 6 minutes. The swelling had worsened, which meant the cysts were becoming unstable, and unstable cysts eventually die. That was the paradox terrifying the doctors. The parasites dying naturally could also trigger catastrophic inflammation. Michael's own immune system had become dangerous. Raband. 3 nights later, Michael asked Mason a question quietly from his hospital bed. "You ever think about what they look like?" Mason didn't answer. The worms! Silence! Michael stared toward the ceiling. They're inside my head right now, not metaphorically, not emotionally, physically, alive. That realization shattered him psychologically. Because parasites trigger a very specific kind of fear in humans. Violation, loss of bodily control, the idea that something foreign has entered the body unnoticed and begun living there. It feels deeply primal, and once patients understand it, many never psychologically recover completely. Michael became afraid to sleep, afraid to eat, afraid to close his eyes. Every headache now carried meaning, every twitch, every sensation, because he knew what caused them, and knowledge made the horror worse. On day 71, doctors repeated the MRI. The room became silent again. Several cysts appeared darker than before, degenerating, dying, which meant the inflammatory response was beginning. And surrounding several lesions, the brain tissue had started swelling visibly. The neuroradiologist enlarged one image repeatedly. Tiny white rings surrounded clusters deep inside the temporal lobe. One physician later described the scan as looking like a storm forming inside the brain. Michael now faced the most dangerous stage of the infection. Not because the parasites were strongest, because they were beginning to die, and every dying cyst increased the risk of catastrophic brain swelling. The battle inside his skull had officially started, and doctors still did not know whether he would survive it. Michael waited 4 days before calling his mother, not because he wanted to hide it, because he still did not fully understand how to say it out loud. How do you explain to someone that parasites are living inside your brain? How do you make that sentence sound real? He finally called from the hospital room just after midnight. The fluorescent lights above him buzzed softly. Machines beeped beside the bed, and for the first 30 seconds, he talked normally. Asked about home, asked about the dog, asked if she was sleeping okay. Then his voice changed. They found worms in my brain. Silence. His mother later admitted she thought he was joking at first, or sedated, or confused from medication. Then she heard him start crying, and suddenly it became real. She booked a flight to San Diego before the call even ended. Inside Michael's skull, the cysts continued changing. Each parasite existed inside a fluid-filled sac, roughly the size of a grape. Some were smaller, some larger. But together, they displaced surrounding brain tissue millimeter by millimeter. Neurons compressed, blood flow altered, electrical signals became unstable. That instability caused the seizures, the headaches, the memory gaps, the strange emotional changes. The human brain operates through electrical precision. Tiny disruptions create massive consequences. And Michael's brain was now filled with dozens of disruptions simultaneously. But the most dangerous damage came from inflammation. Because when surrounding tissue swells inside the skull, there is nowhere for the pressure to go. The brain begins compressing itself. That compression can destroy memory, impair speech, alter personality, trigger psychosis, stop breathing, or kill within minutes. And in severe cases, patients do not die from the parasites themselves. They die from the body's attempt to destroy them. Michael made a mistake one night. He searched his diagnosis online. At first, he wanted reassurance, statistics, recovery stories, something hopeful. Instead, he found MRI images, forums, medical journals, case reports from patients who never recovered, photos of calcified cysts embedded permanently inside human brains, discussions about epilepsy lasting decades after infection, blindness, cognitive decline, sudden death during seizures, and one sentence kept appearing repeatedly across different studies: neurological damage may persist permanently. Permanent. That word stayed with him afterward, because until then, part of him still believed the doctors would eventually fix everything. But parasites inside the brain do not disappear cleanly. Even after they die, they leave scars, and scars inside the brain can change a person forever. Mason started blaming himself in ways that made no logical sense. He knew Michael made the decision himself. He knew he warned him. But guilt does not operate logically. It operates emotionally. He kept replaying tiny moments from the trip. What if he insisted harder? What if he walked away earlier? What if he joked less and sounded more serious? What if he bought Michael bottled water instead? Survivor's guilt often appears after disasters involving random chance, because the human brain hates randomness. It wants explanations, control, meaning. But sometimes, catastrophe comes down to a single decision made in under 10 seconds. A bite of food, a sip of water, one moment. And afterward, people spend years trying to emotionally rewrite something that cannot be undone. Day 79, 2:13 a.m. Michael's girlfriend woke to a choking sound beside her. Michael's body was rigid, arms trembling violently against the mattress, foam collecting near his mouth. The seizure lasted nearly 3 minutes, long enough to deprive parts of the brain of oxygen temporarily. Paramedics arrived to find him confused and partially incoherent. This seizure felt different afterward. Slower recovery, worse memory loss, more difficulty speaking, because repeated seizures physically stress the brain. Neural pathways misfire violently during convulsions, and with every episode, the risk of permanent neurological injury increases. Doctors increased his anticonvulsant dosage immediately, but privately, they worried the infection was accelerating. The next MRI showed increased edema around several cysts, edema, swelling, fluid accumulation inside the brain tissue, exactly what doctors feared most. The parasites were dying, and Michael's immune system was responding aggressively. One lesion near the frontal lobe had enlarged significantly. Another near the temporal region showed surrounding inflammation affecting nearby tissue. The neurologist explained the danger carefully. If the swelling continues increasing, he paused, we may need surgical intervention, brain surgery. The phrase barely sounded real. Michael was 29 years old. 2 months earlier, he was filming food stalls in China. Now surgeons were discussing opening his skull because parasites were dying inside his brain. The speed of the transformation felt psychologically impossible. That is one of the most terrifying aspects of neurological illness. Life divides violently into before and after. And once the division happens, the old version of reality never fully returns. The neurosurgeon reviewed Michael's scans quietly, then pointed toward one cyst near the temporal region. This one concerns me most. The surrounding swelling had begun compressing adjacent tissue. If pressure increased further, it could permanently damage speech and memory centers. But surgery carried enormous risk. The cysts were numerous, deep, and surrounded by inflamed tissue. Operating could trigger additional swelling, bleeding, neurological damage, or fatal complications. Leaving them alone carried risk, too. Everything carried risk now. That's the reality of brain infections. Doctors stop choosing between good option and bad option. Instead, they choose between different kinds of danger. Michael started noticing emotional changes around day 84. Not sadness exactly. Something stranger, detachment. He described feeling separated from himself. Like parts of his personality had become muted. Food tasted duller, music felt distant. Conversations required effort. One afternoon, he stared at old vacation videos from China for nearly an hour. Watching himself laugh beside the food stalls, watching himself eat the pork skewer, watching the exact moment everything changed, then he said something quietly to Mason. I don't feel like the same person anymore. Neurological infections often alter patients psychologically long before others notice it externally. The brain is not just an organ. It is identity itself, memory, emotion, personality, consciousness. And when inflammation spreads through those systems, patients sometimes describe the sensation as losing pieces of themselves gradually. That frightened Michael more than the seizures, more than the worms. The possibility that even if he survived, he might never fully become himself again. By day 91, doctors decided waiting was no longer safe. The swelling continued progressing. The seizures continued worsening. The cysts had to be treated. Michael began antiparasitic therapy under intensive monitoring, albendazole, high-dose steroids, constant neurological observation, and for the first 48 hours, everyone waited anxiously because the danger period had officially begun. As the parasites died, the inflammatory response would intensify. Doctors monitored pupil response, oxygen levels, blood pressure, intracranial pressure, seizure activity. Every headache mattered now, every neurological symptom, every change, because if the swelling accelerated too quickly, Michael could deteriorate within hours. The medication entered his bloodstream slowly, then crossed into the brain, and inside the cysts, the parasites began dying one by one. By the way, if you've made it this far without subscribing, you're officially the type of person who watches someone's entire nightmare for free and then disappears into the void. So subscribe, or go to the comments and explain your decision like a civilized human being. The first severe reaction happened on the third day of treatment. Michael woke with crushing pressure inside his skull. Not a normal headache, not even close. He later described it as, like my brain was trying to push outward through my eyes. Nurses noticed him shielding his face from light almost immediately. Then came the vomiting, then confusion. Then difficulty speaking. Doctors ordered an emergency CT scan. The swelling had worsened dramatically around multiple lesions. Exactly what they feared. The parasites were dying. And Michael's immune system was attacking the dead tissue aggressively. Inside his brain, dozens of microscopic battles were happening simultaneously. Inflammation spread around collapsing cysts. Fluid accumulated between compressed neural structures. Pressure rose millimeter by millimeter inside a skull that physically could not expand. The treatment was working, and that success was becoming dangerous. Michael was transferred to the neurological intensive care unit that afternoon. The room felt colder, quieter, more mechanical. ICU rooms always change the emotional atmosphere of illness because intensive care signals something psychologically terrifying. This can still get worse. Machines surrounded the bed now. Heart monitors, oxygen sensors, intravenous steroid drips, emergency seizure medication within arm's reach. Doctors checked his pupils repeatedly throughout the night, watching carefully for asymmetry, a warning sign of increasing intracranial pressure. One nurse later admitted she barely relaxed during her shift because patients with severe neuroinflammation can deteriorate suddenly. One moment awake, the next unresponsive. That unpredictability creates enormous psychological strain inside neurological ICUs. Not just for patients, for everyone. Around day 96, Michael started hallucinating intermittently. At first, small things, movement in corners, shadows shifting, voices sounding distant or distorted. Then one night, he became convinced insects were crawling beneath his skin. He scratched his forearms until they bled. Doctors explained that severe inflammation near certain brain regions can distort sensory processing dramatically, especially during periods of swelling and medication stress. Steroids themselves can also contribute to psychological disturbances, but understanding the mechanism did not make the experience less terrifying, because to Michael, the hallucinations felt completely real. One evening, he grabbed Mason's wrist suddenly and whispered, "Don't let them get into your head too." Mason later admitted that sentence stayed with him for months. Because for a moment, Michael no longer sounded like himself. He sounded afraid in a completely different way. Michael's mother spent most nights inside the hospital waiting room, sleeping in fragments, drinking bad coffee, watching neurologists walk in and out of double doors for hours. Hospital waiting rooms distort time psychologically. Minutes feel stretched. Phones become terrifying. Every approaching doctor feels like potential catastrophe, and neurological illness creates a unique kind of helplessness for families. Because the patient may still physically look recognizable. Same face, same voice, same body. But internally, something fundamental is happening to the brain itself. The organ responsible for identity, memory, emotion, awareness. Michael's mother later described the experience as watching someone disappear slowly while they're still sitting in front of you. On day 101, a neurologist performed a cognitive assessment beside Michael's bed. Simple questions first. Date, location, current president, then memory recall. 3 objects: apple, mirror, train. Michael repeated them correctly initially. 5 minutes later, he remembered only 1. The doctor remained calm externally, but memory impairment during active neuroinflammation worried them deeply, because it suggested surrounding tissue was struggling under pressure. Michael noticed the doctor writing notes afterward. "What's getting worse?" Nobody answered immediately. That silence frightened him more than the seizures. Patients often detect fear in physicians long before anyone says anything directly. Small pauses, change tone, extra imaging, more consultations. The emotional atmosphere shifts first, and Michael could feel it happening around him. Long-term neurological illness changes people psychologically in ways difficult to explain unless experienced directly. Michael stopped trusting his own body. Every sensation became suspicious. Every headache carried panic. Every moment of dizziness triggered fear of another seizure. He stopped sleeping properly because waking up disoriented terrified him. He stopped eating normally because swallowing reminded him how the infection began. And perhaps worst of all, he stopped trusting his own mind. That is the hidden psychological violence of brain infections. The brain is the tool humans use to interpret reality. When the brain itself becomes unstable, patients lose confidence in perception. Thought, memory, emotion, everything begins feeling uncertain, and uncertainty sustained over months becomes emotionally exhausting. 3 months after Michael's hospitalization, Mason did something he never told anyone immediately. He reopened the Chengdu footage every second, frame by frame, searching. The market looked harmless on video, tourists laughing, steam rising beneath lanterns, food sizzling over charcoal. Normal, that was the disturbing part. Nothing visually looked dangerous. No horror music, no warning signs, no dramatic indication that catastrophe was beginning. Just a crowded food stall like thousands of others around the world. Then Mason found the exact moment. 11:18 p.m. The vendor handed Michael the skewer. Michael smiled directly into the camera and took the first bite. Mason paused the footage there for a long time. Because human beings become obsessed with origin moments after trauma. The exact second before life divided permanently into before and after. The MRI on day 109 showed mixed results. Several cysts had begun calcifying, meaning the parasites inside were dead, but surrounding inflammation remained severe. Tiny white scars now appeared throughout sections of Michael's brain tissue. Permanent marks, evidence the infection had happened. Evidence it might never fully leave. One neuroradiologist described the images carefully to the family. Some patients recover very well, some, not all, because neurological recovery is unpredictable. The brain heals unevenly. Some tissue adapts, some damage persists permanently. Doctors still did not know which outcome Michael would face, and uncertainty became its own kind of suffering. One morning, Michael stood motionless beneath the shower water for nearly 20 minutes, not because he forgot what he was doing, because he suddenly remembered the bucket of water at the Chengdu stall, the steel container sitting open beside the raw pork, the vendor rinsing utensils quickly between customers. At the time, it looked ordinary. Now every detail felt sinister. Trauma changes memory retroactively. Moments that once seemed harmless become loaded with meaning afterward. Michael later admitted he developed an irrational fear of water for several months. Tap water, restaurant drinks, ice cubes, anything unsealed triggered anxiety. because his brain connected contamination with terror permanently now. And once fear attaches itself to survival, it becomes extremely difficult to remove. A medical student asked Michael a question during rounds one afternoon. "Do you regret going to China?" The room became quiet immediately because everyone understood what she actually meant. "Do you regret the meal? Do you regret the risk? Do you regret the choice?" Michael thought for a long time before answering. "No." Then he paused. "I regret thinking bad things only happen to other people." That sentence stayed with several doctors afterward, because severe illness often destroys a psychological illusion many healthy people carry unconsciously. The belief that catastrophe happens elsewhere, to strangers, to unlucky people, not to us. Not from one meal, not from one decision, until suddenly it does. Day 127, 4:42 a.m. Michael woke to flashing lights outside his apartment window. For one brief moment, he thought the seizures were finally over. Then his left hand stopped responding. The sensation spread upward through his arm like electricity. His jaw tightened, vision blurred, and seconds later, his body collapsed violently beside the bed. It became his 9th seizure, and thankfully, his last. Paramedics later described him as conscious but confused, exhausted, emotionally hollow. The MRI afterwards showed something doctors had been waiting months to see. Most of the cysts had calcified completely, dead, mineralized, no longer active. The parasites were finally losing, but the damage they left behind would remain. Tiny white scars across the brain, permanent evidence of invasion. Permanent evidence that something alive once lived there. People imagine recovery as a finish line, especially after survival stories. But neurological recovery rarely feels dramatic. There is no triumphant moment, no sudden return to normal. Instead, life becomes smaller first. Slower, Michael returned home physically alive. But ordinary things now exhausted him. Bright lights triggered headaches, crowded stores triggered anxiety, computer screens blurred after an hour. Sometimes he lost words mid-conversation. Sometimes he forgot why he entered rooms. Sometimes he woke up terrified after dreaming about the market again. Recovery from brain inflammation is not just physical. It is psychological reconstruction. You rebuild trust in your body, in your mind, in your memory, in reality itself. And that process can take years. Mason still travels, but differently now. He checks restaurant kitchens obsessively. Only drinks sealed bottled water, avoids undercooked meat entirely. And every time he boards an international flight, he sends Michael the same message, every single time, without fail. Sealed bottle only. Michael always replies the same way. I know, neither of them ever jokes about Chengdu anymore, because some experiences permanently divide friendships into before and after. And beneath every conversation now, both men understand something most travelers never think about. The difference between disaster and survival can sometimes be one decision lasting less than 10 seconds. One bite, one sip, one moment, that's all it took. Over time, Michael's immune system destroyed the remaining parasites one by one. Each dead cyst hardened into calcified scar tissue, inactive, but still dangerous. Because calcified lesions inside the brain can continue triggering seizures years to, sometimes decades later. That means Michael may never truly escape the infection completely. Even though the organisms are dead, the consequences remain alive inside his nervous system. Doctors calls a chronic seizure risk. Michael calls it something simpler. A reminder, because every MRI now shows the scars permanently. Tiny white marks across black imaging screens, evidence of where the parasites lived, evidence of where they died, and evidence of how close he came to losing everything. 6 months after leaving the hospital, Michael finally reopened the Chengdu footage himself. He watched silently. The lanterns, the smoke, the crowd. Then the vendor appeared on screen, smiling, turning skewers over open flames. Michael paused the frame exactly before the first bite. For several seconds, he just stared at it. That moment fascinated him psychologically, because nothing looked dangerous. That's what disturbed him most. No warning signs, no visible horror, just ordinary life continuing normally before catastrophe quietly begins. That is how many infections work. You do not feel the danger entering your body. You smile, you laugh, you keep traveling. And somewhere beneath the surface, something irreversible has already started. Here is the part infectious disease specialists wish more people understood. Most Western doctors are not actively looking for neuroparasitic disease during early symptoms, not because they are incompetent, because the conditions are rare. A 29-year-old American with headaches usually has migraines, stress, dehydration, sleep deprivation, not parasites embedded throughout the brain. That reality creates dangerous delays, especially after international travel, which is why specialists repeatedly emphasize one thing: tell doctors where you traveled, tell them what you ate, tell them immediately, because the diagnosis doctors never consider is the diagnosis they often miss. And when neurological infections go untreated, the damage compounds silently, week after week, month after month, until suddenly the symptoms are impossible to ignore. People hear stories like Michael's and imagine the horror is the worms. It isn't. The real horror is the delay. The weeks where everything feels normal. The period where life continues unchanged while something silently spreads through the body. You eat, you laugh, you fly home, you post vacation photos online. And all the while, the infection keeps moving. That delayed realization creates a very specific kind of fear, because once symptoms finally appear, you understand the danger began long ago, and there is nothing you can do to undo it. This story is not about avoiding China or fearing travel. The world is worth seeing, different cultures, different food, different experiences. That is not the lesson here. The lesson is smaller and far more uncomfortable. Catastrophic illness does not always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it enters quietly, through a meal, through water, through one ordinary decision made while distracted or excited or curious. And most people never imagine the consequences because consequences feel impossible until they happen personally. Michael Turner survived. Medically speaking, he was lucky. But he still takes anticonvulsant medication every day, still gets follow-up brain scans, still lives with calcified scars embedded permanently throughout his nervous system. And every now and then, he still dreams about the market, the smoke, the lanterns, the pork skewers turning over open flames. Same trip, same city, same street. One friend said yes, the other said no. That was the only difference. That was the entire difference. If this video genuinely disturbed you even a little, subscribe before you leave. Because the people who always say, "I'll do it later," are usually the same people who never find the channel again. And if you still don't want to subscribe, drop a comment and tell me why. I'm curious what your excuse is after watching all of this. This is Hidden Pathogens. I'll see you in the next video. Good night.